So your work is fundamental physics and explores the very limits of matter. How do we protect the spirit of curiosity-driven blue sky research when there is increasing pressure for science to deliver immediate economic utility or results?
Well, that's a big question. I think fundamental science, the exploration of nature, the thirst for knowledge, has to be protected as its own good. The question is, you can ask a society, you can ask the city, you can ask politicians, you can ask citizens of a country, would you be proud if your country has the world-leading observatory for cosmology, or if your country is unique in detecting gravitational waves, which is a mind-boggling idea, but it's reality. Or would you be proud if you have the finest opera or the best writers or the best, people who compose music and musicians? You should be proud of it. It's a cultural value. And I do feel, I will ask me later about the ecological impact and what is the pathway from fundamental science into the technology of tomorrow. But I do feel, if you asked how to maintain it, it has to maintain with the commitment that to do something new, to play music, to think about the world, to think about the universe is human nature. And we have to instill that this has to be preserved. We are no longer humans if we no longer do that.
I want to keep in the same spirit, Professor Christopher. Scientific breakthroughs ultimately drive technological shifts that reshape society, including labor, markets. As we face new waves now of science-led structural changes, how can we ensure that the resulting productivity growth translate into sustainable prosperity for society at large?
Yeah, well, that's the key question that is facing economists, of course. We are not inventing science by any means. What we are doing is what Joel McKeer articulated so well, that first, why do we need growth? And second, how do we make use of growth to improve the welfare and the well-being of the whole of society? Now, that's a very multifaceted problem, and it needs a multifaceted approach in that, first of all, companies need to take on the science and develop it in human-friendly ways, which goes a little bit against what Serge said earlier about the big techs currently, what they're doing. And then we have to, that's at the micro level, if you like, when we look at individual units, and then we have to look at the whole economy and how do we make sure that the gains are distributed evenly with all benefiting. Now, the strong view that I have about this is that growth should be inclusive. We should be paying a lot more attention to the well-being of the workforce rather than, and the population as a whole, rather than just productivity, which reflects what's just been said about the arts and so on. But mainly, to narrow it down to your question, the way that growth should be inclusive is through the labor market, not through taxes. It's not a game of let's tax the rich and give the money to the poor and then we're okay. That's not sustainable. Now, how do you make sure that the labor market benefits everyone involved? And that goes you back to what skills do you need, what training do you need, that everyone should be upskilling. Don't think that when we economists talk about upskilling, we mean that everyone should know how to manipulate the AI programs and write Python and all that. In fact, something like 40% of jobs are not touched by AI in the economy. And the other 60%, most of them are touched only on the surface. And the problem is difficult. It's getting more difficult now because the 40% of jobs that are not touched by AI includes all the caring jobs, education, that in most countries are in the hands of governments. So governments need to keep standards of living and remuneration up to the standards of the rest of the economy there.
Yeah.
And how does it do it now that taxation is so unpopular? It's a big problem. You know, I mean, look at Britain, the Labour government, which is Labour, and they should care, and they do care about these things a lot more. To get elected post-Brexit with the mentality of Brexit and all that, they had to promise there would be no taxation.
Okay.
No taxation, we cannot do anything about hospitals, we cannot do anything about schools. And growth becomes either non-inclusive or no growth, which is what the UK has now.
Okay. So you feel it's a vicious circle? Or I'm imagining this?
It's a terrible vicious,
vicious circle. Okay.
Because they're doing everything piecemeal.
Yeah.
And then you kick the bucket a little bit down, but sooner or later they have to address the big picture. And no one dares do it.
If they have the tool, exactly. If they have the tools and they're willing to address this big picture.
Yeah.
Professor Wolfgang, how should we view the link between pure research in lab and long-term economic growth? Is it possible to quantify the value of fundamental science before it has commercial application?
No, I think it is almost impossible to predict the impact of innovation. And in my field, quantum physics, we can always point to the invention of the laser, the invention of the atomic clock. Purely curiosity-driven. People wanted to understand what light is and invented the laser. If you had given people the task, develop a way to speed up communication, they would not have invented the laser, but it is the laser through optical cables which connects the continents. The whole internet works because we have optical communication via lasers through optical fibers. So the outcome, which often revolutionizes technology and is the foundation of whole new industry, is not on the mind of people who make the discovery. When I made the discovery which led to the Nobel Prize, I had not in mind what people would do with it in the next 20 years. I thought it was a pretty good discovery, and I thought there would be a bunch of interesting things to do. But what people have done in the next 20 years to use ultra-cold atoms for quantum technology, even my boldest imagination would not have thought about it.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm not saying there is the responsibility of scientists to inform people who have to make decisions, to inform the public. But if we go back to the example of the laser, the laser is a wonderful tool for surgery. You can do surgery with less bleeding because if you use the right laser, it's better than a knife or scalpel. But the laser can also be used for Star Wars and can be used to shoot down satellites. So should scientists stop developing the laser because there is a bad application?
No.
Science has to develop knowledge and then has to inform both the public and decision makers what are the opportunities, what are the benefits, and what are the danger. So we need the process. But it's a process which grows in time, and at the moment of this scientific discovery, it is almost impossible to gauge how important and how impactful this is.
How about the economic side, from your perspective? How does fundamental science translate into economic growth? What does the evidence tell us?
Well, the evidence tells us that it takes a very long time, but eventually it does translate to economic growth. What the evidence doesn't tell us is that if we leave it alone, the whole world would not benefit. Now, to make it more specific, though, about the scientific progress that is being talked about now, which is AI.
For example.
I was in Davos a couple of weeks ago at the World Economic Forum, and as you know, all the top CEO guys of big tech are there. And the most optimistic argument I heard actually that is feasible is that if you have the infrastructure to use AI widely in your labor market and society as a whole, it's very cheap to use. Now, the key is the infrastructure, which is connectivity, data centers to train your AI, and energy to run them. Currently, connectivity might be reasonable, but we don't have enough data centers, and the data centers are concentrated in the rich world, not across the globe. And,
Energy is a
and
problem.
we don't have energy sources
Yes.
like we
It's
just heard.
problem, yeah.
Now, once you have those, it's very, very easy to use AI for productivity improvements and the human good. Because those applications we have, those models we have, it's very easy to use. I mean, you know, I know 8-, 9-year-old kids who use ChatGPT and they get as good results as everyone else. So, if we want the current technology, AI, to be more widely spread, to help emerging economies grow, then let the rich countries spend on their infrastructure. Instead of giving foreign aid the way they had been giving, let them build infrastructure for them.
But infrastructure like data center,
center,
for example, in Africa, or
data center, yeah, exactly.
for example,
put data centers in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, of course. Improve their connectivity and help them to get more sustainable energy.
And upscale also for the skills for
when the skills come
later on or before.
But the point is that the skills you need to run, they are not difficult to acquire.
Okay.
They're easy. The difficulty is how do you build the data centers that require vast amounts of electricity, and how do you get the electricity there? There are still countries that are not connected, where they're not on an electricity grid yet. Put them on an electricity grid and make sure they have sustainable sources of energy and use that as your foreign aid.
So the infrastructure is the major now challenge to put for this. I want to move to another topic, Professor Wolfgang. When the world is obsessed now with short-term returns and quarterly result and the quick, fast, result as well, how can we design policy and market incentives that protect long-term basic research?
Well, as I said before, long-term basic research is the search for new knowledge, for new technologies, and it means discovering the unknown. And what I feel is we have to convince, and I always say not just policymakers, also the society, we need voters, we need a society who supports that there is a commitment to fundamental research. And unfortunately, we cannot point to the future and say, if you do this, this is what will come out. But we can look into the past, and we can there's people who have done analysis how scientific discoveries have eventually, 20 years later, contributed to the gross domestic product with a 10-fold return. Or, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have MIT and Harvard. There are many startup companies. And at least some people did an analysis, which I cannot quote, but that the value of the startup companies has been bigger than the public investment into those universities by funding, fundamental research. Yeah. So unfortunately, you cannot predict it one by one. But if you analyze the past, you can make a strong statement.
Sure.
Of course, in our current world, it is a political decision, and especially for countries which are not as rich as other countries, what budget can they invest into the long-term future? Because some countries are facing big crises, and then maybe fundamental research is a luxury. Yeah. How much? This is, of course, a question of policy, but it should be clear that the long-term investment, it pays off. And it pays off for the whole world and not just for your own country.
How do these incentive, Professor Christopher, structures look from a policy and market perspective? What's working and what's not? I mean the incentive of the policy, the market incentive to protect the long-term research, basic research. So how can we protect this structure?
It's not. The way the profession is structured and the way that funding is done, and especially with short-lived governments, they're not really putting emphasis on the long term. I should say that. At least in my view, the European Research Council has been a game changer in the way that it supports 3-4 year programs. I think now they're even thinking of extending the period over which they support it. Economists actually cannot really be accused that in their research they look for the very short term. Economists are particularly bad at predicting the short term. The most popular areas of research in economics would be economic growth, long-term economic growth, you know, the kind of Mokier and his other Nobel laureates this year are doing. The labor market structures that I look at are for the long term.
Yeah.
I mean, Adam Smith, our founder, talked about the long term and the society that everyone is benefiting. The only people who are concerned with the short term are finance economists, but I've managed to keep as far away from finance as possible throughout my career ever since I was a student. I mean, they look at short-term financial gain. I don't really like the way the financial sector works and the inequality that it's bringing into society, but you know, they pay a lot of taxes. Governments don't want to do anything to damage it, and that's it. But I should say, giving the incentives for the long term, they are not really given. Our universities need reform to focus more on the long term. I see more promising movements, in fact, taking place in China than in our countries in Europe or North America.
Really? That's
well, in terms of the number of engineers they turn out, in terms of going for the long term, for open access technologies that will benefit, you know, DeepSeek was a game changer again because it was what they call open source, what we call open access, but basically down to the same thing.
How about the trust, Professor Wolfgang? In an increasingly complex world, how do we maintain public trust in scientific expertise? What does it take for science to remain the reliable bedrock for decision making?
Trust is something personal. You have to trust people. And let me just tell you an anecdote which tells me what public trust in science can mean. I gave a public lecture to thousands of people. After my popular talk, a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, what you said was so exciting. I don't remember anything, but it was exciting." She is trusting scientists because she felt that the scientist is honest, is thinking rationally, and has really discoveries in mind and not some political agenda. She believed in me and she had trust in me, although she didn't understand it. Of course, we want to inform people more.
But this is good. It's a good indicator.
But that would mean I am representing my field, I am representing science as a whole, and trust can only come into the people who do science. And I think this is important. But this is also hard.
It is. Professor, how much this trust is about? Yes, please go ahead.
No, it's about trust. You see, when it comes to economics and economic policy, the trust you need is trust in government. And trust in government is as low as it has ever been.
It is.
When you pay your taxes, you need to trust government that is going to spend it well. Otherwise, you try to find ways to cheat. And how could you trust government? I mean, I don't want to name politicians, but you can imagine which are the ones I have in mind.
But you also have to trust the scientists. That's so important.
Yes.
If you don't trust the scientists, you don't give them money for fundamental research because they do things you don't understand. You have to trust them.
I trust the scientists more than anyone, but then I'm not exactly the average person.
Professor Christopher, that's why my question was...
But I don't trust government.
That's why the trust challenge, is it about the outcomes of the scientist, or how much is it about the institution, about the communication that is not well done by scientists sometimes, or about the expectations in general? I know you said your piece about government. We know that. What else also is it about the trust?
What else we trust? Well, obviously trust in scientific discovery, trusting the tests that are being done. But in economics, you see, economics is basically the ideas that economists have, the institutional structure of a country, and government policy. I mean, it is my strong belief, and I believe many other people's strong belief, that if you leave the economy alone, it will get up to a certain point, it will create too many inequalities, it will create injustices, it will leave people behind. You do need government to help. Mm-hmm. in the running of the economy, but you don't want government to interfere too much, and especially not for the benefit of the politicians themselves. But you have so many instances where someone's been president for 4 years, 5 years, and then they end up with more than double the wealth they had when they started before.
Yeah.
And you don't see much improvement in society. Yeah. Economic policy is the weak link of economic prosperity in most countries that I studied.
That's why I want to end with one question, is how closing the gap. If there is one thing to better bridge the gap between scientific discovery and economic welfare, what would it be? I will start with you, Professor Wolfgang. One thing to gap.
It's all about dialogue. It's about finding common language, and in a way that we are here together between a scientific conference and a government conference.
Yeah.
That's really good. We have to understand each other.
It is.
But also what is, maybe understanding each other also starts with listening to each other, being willing to get the message which the other person wants to provide.
It's a very good message, Professor.
I can be very specific. Let the rich countries cover the Sahara Desert with solar panels, and send the electricity to the whole of Africa, and let them build 3 or 4 data centers.
Yeah.
And
we'll have prosperity. Yeah.
And we have prosperity.
And
we have the sub-Saharan countries joining the G7.
I like this, that we end at least this session with the word prosperity. Thank you so much, professors. It was an honor to be with you today. Thank you very much for being here as well. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you very much.